Uh, Good afternoon.
Good afternoon,
Yeah, good
Mr.
afternoon.
Pranav. Can you hear me?
Yeah, ma'am. It's
I'm
absolutely fine.
audible. Good
Yes.
afternoon.
Yeah. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Swamiji.
Good afternoon, Maharaj. Uh, are we audible, Maharaj?
No, no, Maharaj is muted.
Yeah.
Suddenly, he's not able to hear it. Tell Jagat. Jagat is
Maharaj, are we audible?
Yes,
Yeah.
you can hear me.
Yeah,
Pranav,
absolutely.
Good evening, Maharaj.
Pranav, you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you, sir. Good evening. So, thank you, Pranav.
Ma'am,
Together, this fantastic event, I'm so happy to see something so extensive on eco-criticism
you're so welcome, ma'am. You're so welcome. It's
and
our privilege.
it's wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Can I go then? Yeah. Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone. A very happy new year to one and all. I am pleased to welcome you all to this opening day of the 4-day international conference on eco-criticism theory and praxis, organized by the Department of English of Ramakrishna Mission Residential College, Autonomous, Narendrapur, as a part of the Diamond Jubilee celebrations of the college. It is a proud privilege for the department to be able to host celebrated scholars of national and international repute on this digital platform. This conference seeks to address the major eco-critical concerns that inform contemporary academic discourses as well as the issues relating to environmental humanism, which dwell at the level of practice. We feel compelled to decide on this particular theme for the conference as we feel that our ecological illiteracy and the absence of an ethical commitment to the environment have contributed much to the plight that we have been experiencing almost over the last 1 year. We believe that a literature department like ours should remain committed to making texts accountable to the forces of history and society. And this commitment makes us all the more interested to listen to our distinguished speakers deliberate upon the overarching theme of criticism. The opening session of the conference is virtually graced by the presence of the Secretary of Ramakrishna Mission Ashram Narendrapur, revered Swami Sarvalokanandaji Maharaj, the Principal of Ramakrishna Mission Residential College, Swami Shastraganandaji Maharaj, the Head of the Department of English, Professor Arjo Ghosh, the keynote speaker of the conference, Professor Swarnalata Rangarajan, and the plenary speaker of the conference, Professor Pramod K. Nayak. I would now like to request the Secretary of the Ashram, Revered Swami Sarvalokanandaji Maharaj, to deliver his address of welcome. Maharaj, over to you.
We are very happy that Ramakrishna Mission Residential College, Autonomous, Narendrapur, Department of English has organized a 4-day international online conference as a part of the Diamond Jubilee celebration of the college on eco-criticism theory and praxis. I extend warm welcome to all the esteemed speakers, participants, and the faculty members of the Department of English, Residential College, Narendrapur. So far as I can understand, after going through the matter to be discussed in this conference, at a glance, that eco-criticism is a very modern subject on which people of all walks of life are intently focused. Everybody globally feels deeply concerned about the fast depletion of environmental condition we are present to living in. The problem of erosion of social ecology is multiplying day by day because of indiscriminate encroachment on green surroundings of our planet, making our life more and more hazardous for survival. Industries are required for the establishment of growth of economy, but certainly not at the cost of our ultimate destruction. The literatures, journals, other materials available on this issue of eco-criticism are welcome, but then they should not remain as words alone. We have to rise to the occasion together, and particularly and practically and aggressively, in order to mitigate the destruction of our environmental immediately, since it has already become quite late. The pandemic COVID-19 has duly made us conscious of the fact that we can ill afford to disturb the ecological chain of non-human entities which help us to live healthily. So the discussion and debates will seek a pragmatic approach to accomplish all ecologically humanitarian way of life on the basis of an intimate relationship between literature and physical environment. I fervently hope and believe that this conference, with the participation of reputed national and international scholars, will be subsequently productive in that direction. I finally pray to Almighty that He may graciously endow us with that intelligence so that we can achieve or balance between our material requirement and environmental necessities for our auspicious coexistence with our ecological environment. Once again, I would like to welcome all the esteemed speakers, faculty members of the Department of English, Ramakrishna Mission Residential College, Narendrapur, and also the participants in this conference. I wish before a international conference success, there is no doubt about it. Namaskar.
Thank you, Maharaj, for your such a passionate speech and for blessing us for this conference. I now would like to request the principal of the college, Shami Shastroghanandaji Maharaj, to address this virtual gathering. Maharaj, please, over to you.
Namaskar. My sincere pronouns to revered Swami Sarvalokanandaji Maharaj, Secretary of our ashram. My heartfelt gratitude and namaskar to all the eminent resource persons who will be delivering their undoubtedly thought-provoking talks today and coming 2 days. My namaskar also to all the participants and the organizers, that is the English department of the college. This year, Ramakrishna Mission Residential College Autonomous Narendrapur is celebrating its Diamond Jubilee year. Hence, at the outset, we, the faculties and the administrators of the college, decided to organize some academic webinars, seminars, as seminars are not possible during this pandemic, so we shifted it to webinars. So we thought that some academic webinars, if we can organize such academic webinars, that will be more beneficial for us and also for the researchers, the students, the academic community. For that reason, from the month of August, different departments of this college have been organizing such events. Department of English has already organized, I think, 1 or 2 such webinars, 2 webinars, as I remember, and all these 2 webinars have become very much successful. Today, from today onwards, they are organizing, the faculties of English department are organizing this particular webinar on a really very exciting topic. You see, the persons, the academicians, the researchers who are involved in the study of literature sometimes get fatigued with the literary criticism. Different types of theories, their jargons, their polemics, their cross-cutting debates, sometimes really boring the students, the researchers, the academicians who are involved in the process of literary studies. But at the same time, in fact, it's not a narrative of this present age. Even the famous writer Goethe, the German writer Goethe, he himself told, "Kill the dog, he is the reviewer." So it's probably from a very ancient time, I think, the writers sometimes don't like that the critic will come and will try to analyze, dissect the body of the literary creations. Sometimes they don't like. In fact, Rabindranath Tagore, for that reason, termed this critic as Paunadar Samalochak. That means the critic who are only professionals, who only know how to get profit, how to accrue profit from the criticism. But at the same time, it is true that without literary criticism, without literary theories, we will not be able to go into the depth of the literary creations, especially in the academic arena. So, right from the beginning of the literary creation, literary writings, we saw in Greece, in Latin, in Italy, ancient Italy, in ancient India, different types of theories have come up. There is a famous theory, rasa theory, in the Indian aesthetics, in the Indian aesthetics history. And the Lochana Tika, Dhanya Loka, written by Abhinavagupta. In that Lochana Tika, Abhinavagupta clearly mentioned that if you want to become a real reader, you must have a particular type of training. You must undergo a particular type of training. He has termed the critic, the real reader of the literary creations, literary writings. He has termed them as Saridaya Samajika. And he has given a description how an individual will be able to become a real Saridaya Samajika. Not anyone and everyone can become a Saridaya Samajika. That means he has particularly pointed out that it is not possible for anyone and everyone to become a real reader, an actual reader, a thoughtful reader, of any literary creations. So he has specifically mentioned this term. So that's the point. Whether we like it or not, whether we discard it or not, literary theories, literary practice, literary criticisms are always there. And at the present day, what we see that with this literary criticism, many other aspects of our society, of our culture, of our history, of our science, our environment are coming. They are trying to mix with these literary approaches. They're trying to create a new blend. In fact, this romanticism, the age of classicism, the age of romanticism, and so neo-criticism, neo-romanticism, neo-classicism, all this we have seen. But today, a writer and a reader as well ask a literary creation that how much it is linked with our cultural changing phenomena, how much it is linked with our society, our environmental issues, our political, our historical issues that we every day face. So, with this new trend, the literary criticism is witnessing a paradigm shift in its studies, in its researches. Eco-criticism, I feel, is such an advent in the history of literary criticism. And I do believe that all the experts who are taking part in this webinar will be able to usher in new light in this particular field of study. With the students of literature, with the researchers of literature, the academics who are involved in literary studies will be surely benefit through the discussions and interactions of this webinar. On behalf of the Department of English, on behalf of the college, I welcome all the esteemed resource persons, all the participants, and invite them in exciting debates, in hair-splitting, cross-cutting discussions. I hope at the end we will be enriched. And this enrichment is the aim, the one and only aim of this work. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Maharaj, for motivating us in our endeavor. Thank you for your best wishes, and thank you for elaborating on the necessity of such discussions. I now request Professor Arjo Ghosh, Associate Professor and Head of the Department of English, to welcome our distinguished speakers and participants across the digital platform. Sir.
Good afternoon, all. On behalf of the Department of English, I congratulate our young colleague Professor Pranab Kumar Mondal for organizing this webinar at rather a very short notice and enable scholars on the subject all across the world, top scholars, experts on the subject all across the world, to speak on the issue of this webinar, that is eco-criticism. I am grateful to our revered Secretary Maharaj for blessing us and making introductory comments on the subject. I am thankful to our Principal Maharaj, who has retraced the path of literary criticism, both across the West and the East. Today, he has mentioned Abhinavagupta until we arrive at eco-criticism, and he has talked about the Shahridaya Samaj, how can an individual become a Shahridaya Samaj, and that is by participating in discussions like this. On behalf of the department, let me mention that this is the third webinar in the series to commemorate the Diamond Jubilee of the college. The first webinar was held on the works and legacy of great filmmaker and writer and also painter, Satyajit Ray, book designer Satyajit Ray. The convener was Professor Ashim Mondal. The second webinar was on the poetry of Tate Hughes. The convener was Professor Dibakar Sharkar. And this is the third webinar in the series and the last one. But this third webinar will take place across 4 days on the digital platform. So I welcome the speakers and the viewers and our students and the listeners everywhere who are today in touch with this digital link to make this webinar a great success. I am particularly thankful to Professor Sharnalata Rangarajan of IIT Madras, Professor Pramod K. Nair of University of Hyderabad, Professor Chen Xiang Zheng of Shadong University, Professor Shormishta Chatterjee of Alia University, our own colleague, Professor Bidhuchand Murmu, Brigitte Utter Karnetsky, an eco-filmmaker, and Professor Teresa J. May of University of Oregon. So you can understand that scholars from all across the world are participating in this international webinar. This is the first of its kind being initiated by the Department of English, and I once again express my heartfelt thanks to all the speakers who have kindly given their consent to speak on the subject, and to our young convener, Professor Pranab Kumar Mondal, for organizing this excellent webinar. On all the 4 days and 5 sessions, I request our students and all the viewers to participate in this seminar from 6 to 12, in the afternoon, from 6 to 12 at night. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for setting out a brief trajectory for the conference. Before I formally move on to the first business session of the conference, I just got a message from Professor Nair that he will be joining us at around 5:45 this afternoon. So our plan is that we will have the 2 lectures, one after another, and we'll take the questions for both the speakers together at the end of the plenary section. The participants are requested to write their questions and observations in the live chat box on YouTube. It is now time for the much awaited keynote address, which will be delivered by Professor Sarnalata Rangarajan, Professor of English at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Madras. She is passionate about environmental humanities. She is the founding editor of the Indian Journal of Ecocriticism. Her academic publications include Ecocriticism, Big Ideas and Practical Strategies, and co-edited works titled Eco-Ambiguity, Community and Development, and Ecocriticism of the Global South. She is the co-translator of Mailamma, The Life of a Tribal Eco-Warrior. She is one of the series editors for the Routledge Studies in World Literatures and Environment, and the co-editor of the Routledge Book of Ecocriticism and Environmental Communication. She is the co-editor of the forthcoming A Handbook of Medical Environmental Humanities to be published by Bloomsbury Academic this year. Her short fiction has appeared in anthologies of publishing houses like Penguin, Zuban, Westland, New Asian Writing, South Asian Review, Out of Print magazine, to name a few. Her poetry has appeared in the collection All the Worlds Between and in Muse India. Her debut novel, Final Instructions, was published by Author Press in 2015. She has co-edited a collection of interviews with contemporary women writers from Tamil Nadu titled Lifescapes, which was published by a leading feminist press, Women Unlimited, in 2019. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for being such committed to your words to our conference. You are truly our inspiration despite your several problems, several issues. You have made it to our conference. We are grateful to you. It's a privilege for us to host you this afternoon. Thank you, ma'am. Over to you.
Thank you, Pranav. Thank you for your very kind words. It's indeed an honor to be a part of this very important conference. I want to say thank you and also place on record my deep appreciation for the inspiration and zest shown by the college, the secretary, the principal, the head of the department, and the young convener of this conference for a subject as relevant as eco-criticism. This webinar is truly one of its kind in India, and I'm happy about the good work. Well, the title of my lecture is rather long. I'm sure you've all seen it. It says, From Nature to Nature. Nature with a capital N to nature with lowercase nature. And the subtitle is Ecocriticism and the Anthropocene Imperative. Now, nature, says Raymond Williams, is one of the most complex words in the English language. And I think eco-critics have as much difficulty with it as do others. So I'd like to begin with this observation by Qin Yuan, who was an early follower, 12th century follower of the Zen school of Buddhism, who reflected on his understanding of nature as follows. So I quote, "Before I had studied Zen for 30 years, I saw mountains as mountains and waters as waters. When I arrived at a more intimate knowledge, I came to the point when I saw that mountains are not mountains and waters are not waters. But now that I've got its very substance, I am at rest, for it's just that I see mountains once again as mountains and waters once again as waters." Now I'm sure that all of us realize that the Zen master is defining a Satori moment, a moment of enlightenment. I would call it ecological enlightenment. So, are the three understandings the one and the same? Asked the master at the end of the discourse. Well, this is a question which is very relevant for our troubled environmental times. The master passes through three stages. In the beginning, he takes nature for granted. I saw mountains as mountains, waters as waters. And then he goes on to reduce nature to a mere construct of the mind, a sign within the signifying system. And finally, when he attains Satori, he understands that, I mean, this is exactly what Wordsworth says. Human beings should suspend the meddling intellect, which I'm quoting from Wordsworth, which misshapes the beauteous form of things, and attune themselves to a larger enlightenment, which includes mountains, waters, as well as minds. Um, the principal Swami was talking about a paradigm shift, rightly so, because as a result of the environmental crisis, a renegotiation of a modern civilization's relationship with reality is required. So, influential works like Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions have spoken about the shifting paradigms relating to metaphors used to guide theory formations in science. So, Kuhn says we have to be very, very careful about the conceptual frameworks which we are using when we are talking about a specific situation. Now, let us look at the isms which we normally encounter in our own discipline, right? Let me begin with modernism and its relationship to nature. What does modernism say? Modernism says that reality is not personal, it has no intrinsic value, but is ordered by natural laws. And we can understand and master nature by obeying these laws. Well, postmodernism led us further away from the natural world because it began to treat nature as a mere social construction. So, according to the postmodernist paradigm, reality is neither personal, it's not orderly. All approaches to the natural world are therefore relative, and there is no value to life other than what we create. But what is an ecological approach? An ecological approach would say that reality is personal, it is ordered, and this order is created by multitudes of beings striving to realize themselves in multidimensional relationships. So, how do we understand nature? So, let's look at it in a very simple way. Nature must be understood as structured by meanings as well as by physical causality. Think of nature as a psycho-physical system with an inner poetic aspect and an outer causal one. So it is this inner poetic aspect which is capable of commanding us emotionally as well as making a claim on our moral consideration. So we can use the term ontopoetics to denote both the order of meanings that structure this inner aspect on the one hand, and the practices by which we engage with this order of meanings. So, what is the paradigm shift? The paradigm shift, I would say, is from parts to the whole, or in other words, a shift from objects to relationships. We can even call this systems thinking because systems thinking is about contextual thinking. Explaining things in terms of their context means explaining things in terms of their environment, and all systems thinking is environmental thinking, therefore. So before I go on to eco-criticism, let me quickly say that the function of eco-criticism is to talk about the embeddedness of self in the context of any lived experience. So this is a subject which has been endlessly discovered or discussed by strands of eco-critical theory like ecofeminism, post-colonial eco-criticism, eco-Marxism, deep ecology, material eco-criticism, so on and so forth, right? But what would a gestaltic view of embeddedness in this world. Is not a, it is an event. It is not a noun, but it's a verb. It's happening now. And remember, this is created by millions of humans and greater than humans who are striving to achieve their maximum potential. So we live in a world of meaning, and meanings are inherent in things themselves. And each phenomenon we experience is speaking in its own language. It speaks whether we are listening or not. So we are meant to perceive this with a mode of consciousness other than the linear analytical mind. And this kinesthetic appreciation of being in the world happens only when we are in a free narrative space. Now, what is a free narrative space? It's a term used by deep ecologist Alan Drenson. A free narrative space is basically something which is creative, which is open ended, which is not controlled by hierarchies. It is the space where we can really talk about democracy, biocentric equality, and so on and so forth, right? Because in this free narrative space, all stories can be heard. And all of us are finally stories in the long run, right? The human has a story, the other than human has a story, every community has its story, every country has its story, Gaia has her own stories. So this free narrative space is a kind of polyphonic space, what Bakhtin calls polyphony, where all stories are heard without any hierarchical prioritization. So let me begin with uh, a small example from Gary Snyder's writings. So Gary Snyder is, of course, the poet of deep ecology, beat poet, but now his writing is totally earth-centric. I'm just going to use a sutra from Gary Snyder's Blue Mountains Are Constantly Walking. As all of us know, a sutra is condensed wisdom. It's like a zip file, these are the two lines of the sutra. Blue mountains are always walking. If you doubt the mountains walking, then you do not know your own walking. Blue mountains are always walking. If you doubt the mountains walking, you do not know your own walking. Now, is this just the stuff of poetic fancy? No. Snyder's mountains and streams are processes of this earth. They roll being and non-being together. Think of a mountain, a mighty mountain which is eroded, which becomes dust, enters rivulets, streams, rivers, reaches the ocean, evaporates, comes back as rain. Blue mountains are always walking. So this whole idea of a dynamic environment is what we have to keep in mind when we are talking about nature. Sadly, I think one of the speakers ahead of me mentioned this. Various schools of critical theory since the 1960s have participated in the project of denaturalization of nature, the revision of which is one of the primary aims of eco-criticism. Since the 60s, it has become obligatory, almost obligatory, to declare that there is no such thing as nature, since nature has been reduced to a term within a cultural discourse. Today, we bandy the word construct with so much of aplomb. So that's why, eco-philosophers like Kate Soper protest against the reduction of nature to a mere linguistic construct by pointing out that, I quote, in short, it is not language which has a hole in its ozone layer. The real thing continues to be polluted and degraded, even as we refine our deconstructive insights at the level of the signifier. So the real thing, quote unquote, which Soper talks about, is very difficult to define, right? And that's why I have two natures in my title: nature with a capital N and nature with a lowercase n. To clarify why I have used uppercase and lowercase, I'm going to invoke yet another important book by journalist McKibben. It's a very important book on climate change, which came out in the year 1989. It's called The End of Nature. So McKibben says nature has ended due to excessive modification of the earth by humans, which is a characteristic feature of the Anthropocene age. Now, is the end of nature the death of nature? No. What McKibben is trying to tell us is that we have changed the atmosphere and we are changing the weather. I'm quoting from McKibben. We have deprived nature of its independence, which is fatal to its meaning. Nature's independence is in its meaning. Without it, there is nothing but us. Therefore, acts of nature, sandstorms and cyclones and hurricanes are no longer acts of God in the Anthropocene age, but they are acts of man. So the end of nature is the end of an idea. The idea of an independent, mysterious force that is beyond human control, prakriti, as the Upanishads would call it, right? So that is nature with a capital N. But what have we done? We have modified that. So in our new paradigm, in the Anthropocene paradigm, nature, prakriti, is reduced to a problem that needs to be worked out through human intervention. There is yet another book that I would like to foreground. Timothy Morton's book, provocatively titled Ecology Without Nature, right? Ecology Without Nature. This book came out in the year 2007, and it argues that the very idea of nature as a transcendental, independent term, which informs arts, ethics, philosophy, and our ecological politics, may become obsolete when we understand what truly constitutes ecological thinking. So McKibben infamously says, in order to have ecology, we must let go of nature. He's talking about nature with the capital N, because this nature with the capital N stands for qualities like authority, harmony, purity, mystery, hierarchy. And Morton says, well, we have generated so much of waste. We have nuclear waste, which is threatening us. There is so much of pollution. Look at the detritus that development has created on the face of this earth. That's also nature. Can we just banish it and say that does not belong to the earth? We cannot do so. So, the ecological thought does not refer to natural things alone. On the other hand, it denotes the interconnected mesh. Mesh, again, is a term which is coined by Morton to talk about our state of being in the Anthropocene. It denotes the interconnected mesh of everything that surrounds us and of which we are a part. So, to live in a truly ecological way, we have to let go of nature. So the essence of all these new ideas is the notion of coexistence. We can, we have to, or we are forced to. But since we are all environmental thinkers, we have to think creatively about how to coexist with human life forms, non-human life forms, non-life forms. Talk about plastic, the ecosystem, the biosphere, climate, planet, solar system. Just look at this. It's like a multiple series of nested Russian dolls. You know, if you open a Russian doll, those Matrushka dolls, there's the big doll which contains a smaller doll, a smaller doll, a smaller doll, and so on and so forth. That's the model of the universe, right? That's how we are suspended in this matrix of existence. So, all of us like to define the self. Who are we, and um, uh, where we are? I mean, I think these are important questions. Who am I, and where do I come from, and where am I going? these are philosophical questions, but they're also questions which invoke eco-philosophical reflection. So it's a complex question, it's a riddled question in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, a term coined by Eugene Stormer in the 1980s, popularized by Paul Crutzen in the 2000s. It's a disputed term referring to the new epoch in which human actions have irreparably affected the planet. So we live in a world where the impact of humanity on life's natural processes and systems is becoming frighteningly evident. I don't have to say this, atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide have recently, surpassed the dreaded 400 ppm parts per million threshold. It is interesting that post lockdown, there was a survey conducted in New York, and they found out that carbon monoxide emissions had reduced to 50%. And also, the emission of planet heating gases like carbon dioxide also went down considerably post lockdown. But before the lockdown, I don't know, or perhaps after the vaccine, after the threat of the virus is past, will biodiversity laws, will the vanishing of species, because I believe in the Anthropocene age, as a result of human intervention, the vanishing of species is 100 times faster. So that is why scientists fear that the Earth's sixth mass extinction will be caused by humans. So we have entered a new epochal consciousness. I'm using Carl Jasper's terms. But irrespective of the debates regarding the dating of this geological era, when did the Anthropocene begin? Did it start in 1492 with Columbus and the European Holocaust in the Americas? Did it start in 1784 with the invention of the steam engine, which ushered in the Industrial Revolution? Or with with the explosion of the atom bomb in 1945 and the great acceleration, which is the spread of industrialization in the world? Whatever it is, the conclusion, regardless of all these debates, is that human history cannot be understood as separate from the history of the earth. So Bruno Latour has famously argued in his classic work, We Have Never Been Modern, that modernity as a successful and rational framework of thinking has been challenged by the Anthropocene, or the intrusion of Gaia. So let us define the Anthropocene as an era of complex entanglements between nature or other than human forces and human action. What critics refer to as entangled humanism. So, in this new paradigm, nature is no longer the passive background but an active protagonist. Therefore, the dichotomy between agential man and passive nature is fundamentally questioned, challenged. But one of the good things that the Anthropocene has to offer us is perhaps a larger concept of selfhood. Um, Critic Donna Haraway calls it a becoming with. A becoming with, what is becoming with? According to Haraway, it's a performance, a cultivation of interconnections, and an act of resistance against the threat of extinction, which inevitably involves how we tell stories through and with other stories. Right? So we have to be in this together in order to survive. That seems to be the basic message. And therefore, the Anthropocene is a clarion call to new modes of knowing, new modes of engaging in ways that are less human centered or anthropocentric. So, read in this way, the Anthropocene is inescapably bound with an ethical demand, because we need to inhabit this world in a spirit of mindful accountability, not just to our generation, but to all those multi species generation who are going to come after us. So, when I speak about the Anthropocene imperative, this is exactly what I mean. I borrow imperative from Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, something which you have to do no matter what. So, this is what we need to remind ourselves of continuously in the Anthropocene. Finding new ways of responding to this planetary tragedy is both a conceptual as well as representational challenge to humanistic scholarship. So, Amitav Ghosh, in his recent book on climate change, observes that in a substantially altered world, readers and consumers will look for traces of these changes in literature and the arts. So, any expectation of normalcy, balance, order will tantamount to what Ghosh calls the great derangement. So, the world we are living in is witnessing a radical eclipse of nature. I'm using Frederick Jameson's phrase, in which even the timeless natural order cannot be taken for granted. Right? We are all experiencing climate change. Chennai is experiencing rains in January. It has never been the case. Because nature is being relentlessly modified by man. Hence, environmental narratives that characterize our times must abandon the romantic return to an Edenic myth of pastoral plenitude and pristine wilderness, and increasingly turn to a truly materialist vision that articulates dispossession, loss, disease, and a whole host of other themes that characterize the dark thanatos of environmental pollution, toxicity, and slow violence. So there are innumerable ways in which these narratives connect the personal and the political, the home and the world, the rural and the urban, the human and the more than human, human and the mission, the local and the global and the planetary, that help us to enter what Alan Drengson, I mentioned him earlier, refers to as the free narrative spaces. Because it's only in these open space visions that the alternative tales of sustainability, earth, democracy, and a whole host of other issues can be given free expression. These narratives are articulated in terms of systems that are open ended and creative. And to quote Snyder again, narratives are one sort of trace that we leave in the world. All our literatures are leavings. See, when an animal, a nocturnal animal, does its rounds in the morning, it leaves behind its trails. We know that this animal has been there. You look at the pug marks, or the scent of the animal is a dead giveaway. So too, our literature, says Gary Snyder, they are our traces, our leavings, right? So, eco-criticism is a part of this gestalt and grand storytelling. It can be even called the story of all things, which makes possible and a literary appreciation and creation that is local and global, where there is no one dominant story. Well, in today's culture, we live in a condition of inundation, right? We are up to neck in data. There is so much to interpret, right? Whether it's about, pollution, toxicity, or whether it's about the pandemic, the mutation of the virus, we struggle to understand big numbers because as a species, we tend to care about individual cases, and we are disinterested by vast processes. So, how do we understand something like climate change, or using plastic, which is bad for the earth? I'm sorry, I forgot to share this visual with you. There is this installation artist called Chris Jordan, CHRISJORDAN. You can Google him. So Chris Jordan does very interesting work. If you look at his installations, he has these wonderful recreations of grand masters like Botticelli. Venus rising from the ocean is one of his most famous installations. So if you look at it from a distance, it just looks like a normal painting. But if you go very close, you realize that the whole painting has been made of millions and millions of plastic bags And I think Jordan has a specific number to indicate this is the kind of waste that is generated in the US every minute, right? So if you go very close, you see the plastic bags. But if you stand far away, you are not able to see the plastic bag. So that's the problem about scale, right? So in eco-critical jargon, we use a term called the Trans-Scalar Perspective, right? You need to be able to go close so that you understand what is wrong with the planet. You also need to see the big picture, right? So that kind of negotiation is needed if we need to understand numbers from our heart, because numbers themselves are far from being the concrete form of reality. They are a form of abstraction, right? All humanists will understand that. Numbers are an abstraction. They remove feeling from experience and just leave us with data, right? So this is due to fundamental shifts in consciousness that occurred during the 20th century and still continue to intensify. See, once upon a time, as a species, we knew the world with our senses. It was determined by many brute realities, by the weather and terrain. But in a new reality, we are cut off from the weather. For the real, we are substituting the virtual, isn't it? So there is this very nice book called New World, New Mind, written by a neurologist called Robert Ornstein and a population biologist called Paul Eldridge. So they give us an explanation about why this happens. Why are we so complacent about environmental issues, right? Because I mean, we don't think that somehow we are going to suffer, right? We see it happening, right? But we don't accept it. So why does this happen? I quote, we don't perceive the world as it is because our nervous systems evolved to select only a small extract of reality and to ignore the rest. Instead of conveying everything about the world, our nervous system is impressed only by dramatic changes. We need shocks and tragedies to goad us into action. So Thoreau wrote once upon a time, we need to be provoked, goaded like oxen as we are into a trot. So think about it. Um, you know, um, we as a species, our nervous systems have evolved to only understand the coronavirus or the Bhopal gas tragedy. But there is a lot happening, right? And that's why Rob Nixon, another influential eco-critic, talks about slow violence. It's slow incremental violence. The food we eat, the water we drink, right? So that is, I mean, modifying us, modifying our genes, and it is a slow process which will affect us in the long run. Nobody pays any attention to that. So that is dark nature, N, nature with the small n, which we have to embrace and own and perhaps bring it into the light of our awareness so that we can do something about it. Now, eco criticism, reimagining our relationship with the planet through narratives. I'm going to speak about this for some time. So, since the 1960s, there has been I'm going to give a very brief overview because I'm not sure whether there is time. I still have just half an hour to end. Yes. So, since the 1916, there has been a lot of important North American writing about the relationship between human beings and the natural world. Cheryl Glotfelty, the editor of the first Eco-Criticism reader, defines eco-criticism as the relationship between literature and the physical environment. So, this body of literature, known variously as nature writing or environmental writing, that is the idea, has the potential to help readers to reimagine their relationship with the planet. And I think one person we have to remember, especially in this context, is this scientist who wrote an important book called The Silent Spring, Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson, who was working on the effects of pesticides like dialdrin, aldrin, which were introduced in the US in the 1960s. And there were huge successes because they were doing their job. But what Carson noticed was that entire bird populations seemed to be dropping off, dying. And when she started recording this, the entire agro-business industry did not allow her to publish. So she had to publish because it was a strong ethical demand. She was writing about nature with a small n. So she does something which is very fascinating, right? Um, she uses the language of rhetoric, right? She does a crossover kind of writing. She borrows from the tropes of literature. Silent Spring itself is borrowed from Keats's poem La Belle dans son Mercy. So the landscape goes bleak, withered, and no birds sing because of the curse of this mysterious woman. So the Silent Spring, which is actually a scientific book, it actually talks only about the pesticides, dialdrin, aldrin, and the rest. But the first chapter, the opening chapter, is called A Fable for Tomorrow, right? So this is how it begins. Once upon a time, in a small town in the heart of America. And she goes on to paint a perfectly lovely pastoral picture: silver trout lying in the streams, foxes barking in the countryside, and everybody is happy. But suddenly, a strange, mysterious blight descends, and people sicken and die, right? But Carson says, no witchcraft, no spell had harmed them, they did it to themselves. So, what she's doing is she's using the trope of the apocalypse as well as the pastoral, two very ancient ways of imagining our relationship with the world. She uses it to evoke horror, to evoke fear of what the future can hold if we don't have stewardship towards nature. So, coming back to the question, can eco critics, are they qualified to talk about ecological problems? I think the answer is no. Let's take, for instance, uh, weeds. John Passmore has this fascinating question, poet John Passmore. He says, define a weed. Suppose if this had been a live session, I could have thrown the question at you. And most of us would say the weed is an unwanted plant, it's a useless plant. So we have a lot of precipice back in our campus, and we did away with it because the government asked us to do. But another variety of precipice is revered in Rajasthan. It's extremely drought resistant, and people, take care of the precipice plant there. Same plant, different locations, different ways of defining the plant. So, what is a weed? Is weed a useless plant? Passmore would say a weed is just the wrong plant in the wrong place, right? So, getting rid of weeds is a ecological problem. But a problem in ecology arises because of our representations of nature in our cultural spaces, right? We define. So this problem of definition, that's where the eco-critic comes in, right? So, an important, I was talking about the origins of eco-criticism. I'm sure all of you know this. An important landmark in the history of eco-criticism was the founding of ASLE, the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment in the United States in 1992. ASLE's influence spread quickly with international affiliates being established globally. There are sister institutions all over the world: Japan, the UK, Ireland, South Korea, Singapore, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Brazil, Europe. So, if at all you are interested in eco criticism, I would encourage all of you to, um, attend these conferences organized by ASLE affiliates throughout the world. Okay, going back to the term eco-criticism, first used by William Rueckert in his essay, Literature and Ecology, um, used in 1978. But however, the roots of this emergent earth-centric literary theory lie deep in the past. Scott Slovic, a foundational eco-critic, effectively sums up this paradox. He says, after 3 decades of doing this work, I still cannot pinpoint the text of eco-criticism, the absolute source. Um, Many definitions of eco-criticism, but I'm just going to talk about one. William Howard traces the etymology of the term eco-criticism to the Greek word oikos, meaning household, and kritis, meaning judge. Oikos is nature, a largest homestead, and kritis is the arbiter of taste who wants the house kept in good order, no booths or dishes strewn about to ruin the original uh, decor. So, a quick look at the progress of this theory. I'm sure we'll be talking more about it in the days to come, so I will not spend too much time. The first wave began in the 1980s, defined nature as natural environment, argued for the protection and preservation of the natural environment from marauding humans. Second wave, which happened in the mid 1990s, moved away from dichotomized discourses of nature writing to a more inclusive dialogue, which included urban landscapes in addition to wilderness. Third wave, approximately the year 2000, marked by a comparative tendency across national and ethnic cultures. Joni Adamson and Scott Slovic in the 2009 special issue of Malus talks about it as they talk about it as the insurgence of a diversity of voices contributing to the understanding of the human relationship to the planet. Eco-criticism of this period is marked by concepts such as eco-cosmopolitanism that reveal the dialectical tension between the local and the global sense of place. Fourth wave is about the fundamental materiality of environmental things, places, process, forces, experiences, right? And Slovic again cites path-breaking works like Material Ecofeminisms. It came out in 2008, edited by Stacy Alaimo and Susan Heckman, which emphasized the inherent materiality of the human body and the natural world. And they draw attention to how the retreat from materiality and its denial have had serious consequences for feminist theory and practice. So, this is a whirlwind tour about the 4 waves. So, when we are talking about nature with a small n, I think we will situate ourselves in the 3rd wave and the 4th wave, right? So today I'm going to give you an example of eco-critical interpretative practice using, the example of swarms. And I'm going to talk about how literary texts can wield immense power in shaping geographical imagination by using the example of swarms that have represented the trope of wilderness for writers from diverse backgrounds and periods of history. I think I have 20 minutes more. So I'll try to look at 3 writers: John Bunyan, Thoreau, and Sarah Joseph, a contemporary writer, whose work brings to light the evolving cultural commentary on the status of wetlands. And these works are powerfully ethic. So let me begin with the science of wetlands. See, from a scientific point of view, the wetlands can be called nature's kidneys. They help in long-term carbon storage, water cycles. They can have moderating effects on climate change, and they are global habitats, which means they can occur in plains. They can also occur in alpine habitats, and they're also ecotones, transition areas where 2 distinct biological communities meet. So you can't call them either water or land, right? You can call them waterland, a kind of continuum between aqua and terra, right? Despite the fact that wetlands have played a vital role in ecosystem dynamics, humans have always resisted them and regarded wetlands with hostility. So, William Howard, an influential humanistic geographer, talks about this. He said, why do humans dislike wetlands so much? wetlands are claustrophobic because they don't give us a sense of horizon, right? Because they force us to turn inwards, and that's not such a nice thing for most of us. And secondly, they're a patient environment because things are always in this process of perennial becoming, right? So if you leave a wetland undisturbed, it can transform muck into peat, coal into other substances of value. But it can also inspire feelings of alienation, of terror, dread. So humans don't like them. And thirdly, they are transition zones. So remember, they are ecotones. So they inspire divided values like difficulty or uncertainty. And most importantly, wetlands are anoxic, which means they produce methane and not oxygen. And we are oxygen loving creatures, and therefore we don't see value in this. And that's why wetland disaster, wetland drainage has constituted a major part of the eco disaster that followed the European colonization of the Americas. Wetlands were considered to be dangerous places, breeding miasmatic diseases. And therefore, at the time of the European invasion in the 1600s, almost 85% wetland cover was lost. That's what the research says, right? But it was a very different story for the original inhabitants, the native Indians who thrived in the swamps, practicing subsistence, farming, foraging, hunting. So the marginalization of the indigenous people and the draining of wetlands, there were two parallel processes in the colonial machinery. So the conversion of marshlands into fertile agricultural lands contributed to the idea of America as an agrarian republic, right? And I'm sure most of us will remain will would have read, classic texts like William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation, written between 1630 and 1651, which it describes the early years of the founding of colonies by the Pilgrim Fathers. Because Bradford describes the new world and its original inhabitants as a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men. So his hostility was colored by his Puritan outlook because he thought that the pilgrims were the covenant people, and he compared their trials and tribulations in the new world to the 40 years of wandering in the Sinai wilderness by the Hebrews, right? So the Puritans literally converted the command found in the book of Genesis, right, for humans to have dominion over the earth. They did not approve of the fact that native Indians did not own land, did not want to own land titles, enclosed land, or raise livestock or hold title deeds. No, they did not like this. And therefore, the European colonizers attempted to modify the landscape in the spirit of the Protestant passion for reformation. So these sentiments find full expression in the Great Swamp War fought in December 1675 during King Philip's war between the colonial army of New England and the Narragansett tribe. And no prizes for guessing, most of them were killed, right? So the Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan was published 3 years after the Great Swamp War, 1678. So it also powerfully illustrates Puritan attitudes that objectify the natural world and reduce it to a set of symbols for spiritual instruction. It's a religious allegory. All of us must have read this wonderful narrative. Every man who flees the city of sin in search of the celestial city. Uh, he's supposed to take only the straight and narrow path because the way is fraught with temptations, dangers, and digressions. But he and his friend called Pliable, they digress and they fall into a filthy quagmire, quote unquote, which is the slough of despond. The slough of despond is chapter 16. So let me just quote from Bunyan's text. The miry slough is such a place as cannot be mended. It is the descent whither the scum and filth that attends conviction for sin doth continually run, and therefore it is called the slough of despond. It has swallowed up at least 20,000 cartloads, yea, millions of wholesome instructions. So I hope you noticed words like sin, um, cannot be mended. So, because words which are normally associated with wetlands are bog, swamp, fen, mire, black water. Uh, and there are claustrophobic undertones, as I mentioned, of entrapment, disease, death, disorientation. All these perhaps reflect what eco-critic Duckert calls the human fear of interstitial geography. So, another critic, Rod Giblet, talks about the need for a counter tradition of swamp speak, one that can rigidly, question the binaries and knowledge practices by emphasizing what environmental thinkers such as Timothy Morton refer to as the mesh, the anamorphous rhizomatic networks we share with the non human. So, the counter tradition is offered by the transcendentalist thinker Thoreau. Thoreau's intimate swamp speak reimagines the stern monologue of Bunyan, who silenced the swamp. So, in his important essay, Walking from Walden, Thoreau writes, I would recreate myself. I see the darkest wood, the thickest and most interminable, and to the citizen most dismal swamp. I enter the swamp as a sacred place, a sanctum sanctorum. There is the strength, the marrow of nature. Because to Thoreau, the marsh was a place where he could renew himself. He was tired of city life. He was tired of the set patterns of the mechanical life that he had to follow. And therefore, he says, the civilized nations, I quote from Thoreau again, Greece, Rome, England, have been sustained by the primitive forests which anciently rotted where they stand. They survive as long as the soil is not exhausted. Alas, for human culture, little is to be expected of a nation when the vegetable mold is exhausted. So, Thoreau is again talking about a very important scientific fact here. So, ancient civilizations have been supported by the decay and life, which are parallel processes in a um, ecotone system, right? And Rome fell because all of us know that the fall of Rome was also an environmental fall, because Rome had lost its topsoil and it was heavily dependent on the countries it colonized, like Egypt, for for its food grains and so on and so forth. So, Thoreau's Walking, offers a symbolic marriage of two images: the Garden of Eden, the ubiquitous pastoral trope of Western literature, and the dark, dismal swamp. So, what we have here is a dark Eden, right? Um, uh, so, so Thoreau is talking about the need to look at things which we have held in mistrust because of our own limitations. Now, the third text, which I'm quickly going to run through, is an important text, Sarah Joseph's Gift in Green, translated from the original Malayalam. The original Malayalam novel is called Adi. Adi is again a place of primordial purity, the fictional village of Adi. It is dotted with water bodies and marshlands and slush, right? And Gift in Green, it articulates deep environmental awareness, which is very typical of the environmental justice movements in the state of Kerala, right? Think about the Silent Valley movement, the Plachimada protest against Coca-Cola, the anti-endosulfan struggle, and so on and so forth. And Kerala has lost nearly one-fifth of its wetland cover, the Kawai wetland, for instance, because of myopic developmental plans, and well, the usual list of problems: pollution, landfilling, sand and laterite mining, unscientific development of tourism, and so on and so forth. So, to go back to the novel, Gift in Green, the inhabitants of Adi are members of the Pulaya Dalit community, a despised and ill treated people who make a covenant with this small island which is brimming with fresh waters. So they are the ecosystem people, to use Guha and Gadgil's term. They subsist on the abundant fish and crabs. So this is indeed a pastoral scene until one of the inhabitants who is educated comes back and literally sells the village to the city. He dumps the village with trash, and very soon we are given a nightmarish picture of the stagnant water world where everything is decomposing, everything is smothered in stink. Now, I'm going to talk about Swarm Speak in this novel. A very brief uh, observation. Chapter 16 of the novel. It presents Swarm Speak through the language of myth and storytelling. So there is a magician who lures the children with a cart of sweet. He empties the cart into the marshland, so the sweets disappear and the children are disappointed. So he asked the children, would you prefer a playground where the sweets will not disappear? And the children say, yes. So it is then that the magician tells them the story of the water goddess of fish and rice who dwells in a water mansion in astounding purity. If the marsh went dry, the water mansion would collapse and the goddess would go away. Her wrath would bring about a spate of droughts, fish would perish, the marsh would exhale noxious gases, the trees and wildlife would be scorched by heat, and people would have to leave the place forever. Now, this novel is special to me because the marshlands of the fictional Adi offer a biocentric vision, which is rather unusual for a global South narrative, because it is customary to portray global South narratives as spaces where there is a fight between or struggle for survival between human and non-human nature. But to Sarah Joseph, Adi is not a utopia, but it's a society which understands interbeing, right? So I'm quoting from Sarah Joseph's interview. In the scheme of things in Adi, human life is only as important as the life of the fish, the butterflies, the waterfowl, the mangroves, the waterbeds, the sludge, and so on. So, texts like these teach us to cherish wilderness and also remind us of our own biological embeddedness in the wider reaches of evolutionary time. So, a good marshland ethic can sensitize us to our earth ancestry and the bonds that we share with our non human others. So, to conclude, I would say that eco-critical praxis facilitates a major shift in perception, coming home to the realization that the world is your body, right? So, I'd like to cite a small, you know, uh, sort of story, but it's an image from the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Buddhist Avatamsaka Sutra, which is a Mahayana text. It's a story about the Indra's net, and this story is very popular even with quantum physicists because they use it as a metaphor for the hidden interconnections and interdependencies of the quantum connections interlacing the entire universe and connecting us to every particle of matter. Now, this is how the story goes. At the nodal juncture of Indra's Fable net, filling the whole of space, is a multifaceted jewel representing a life form or a unit of consciousness which reflects all the jewels in the material matrix. Since each jewel is intrinsically connected to the others in the net, a slight change in one jewel is reflected in all the others and the entirety of space. So, although presented in mythic terms, this image reminds us of the myriad strands that constitute the web of life and the complex material and cultural circuits that crisscross the globe. So, eco-critical praxis is one of the myriad ways of honoring what the Buddhists call a Sangha, the great community of earth beings. I will conclude with the opening lines from Sukanta Chowdhury's wonderful work, The Metaphysics of a Text. So, Sukanta Chowdhury, again, gives us a story from the life of Buddha. So Buddha is watching Ananda teach his disciple, right? And the disciple, Ananda's student, um, is saying this over and over again, right? Um, all this learning, all this wisdom is of no avail if I don't understand the truth about the heron in the water, the heron bird, the heron in the water. So the student is going on saying this, and Ananda gets very upset because the student has mispronounced the Sanskrit, the Pali word. Instead of saying Udaya Vyayam, which means the beginning and ending of things, the student mistakenly says Udaka Bakam. So Udaka Bakam is the heron in the water. So Ananda chastises his student. And Buddha, who is watching this from a distance, summons the student and says, don't worry about your teacher. You are indeed saying the right thing, right? It is important to know a lot about the heron in the water. So thank you very much for listening to me with patience. The heron in the water, we don't have the capital N nature, unfortunately, but what we can claim, what we can redeem is nature with a small n, which is indeed the heron in the water. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for such a wonderful lecture. You have really traversed a long path, a vast path from Zen philosophy to British literature, to the Upanishads, to relevant literatures and criticisms of concerns. Thank you for teaching us in such a lucid way. You have elaborately taught us to understand nature from vast perspectives. You have elaborated upon the ideas related to Anthropocene. And throughout your wonderfully engaging lecture, you have attempted to literate, more importantly, to literate our students and participants ecologically. You have enlightened us to the form of ecological crisis that are specifically human-made. And also thank you for telling our students various associations which work on this field of ecocriticism. You have opened up really new horizons before us, and you have certainly motivated us to engage in serious researches on ecocriticism. Thank you so much, ma'am. And just we have we have just got a message from Professor Nair. He is having some issues with his system. So yeah,
Can I take my questions? Can I take questions?
Yeah, sure. We would like to go with the questions now. To the participants, we are extremely sorry. We may not be able to host Professor Nair today. We are extremely apologetic for that. I'm taking the questions now for Professor Rangarajan. The first question we got is from our another speaker of this conference. She is Brigitte Utter-Konetsky. She is from Switzerland. She is a wonderful and very celebrated eco-filmmaker. So she has a question for you, ma'am. She says that thank you for compelling and enriching insights into the topic, the world and nature / nature with uppercase and lowercase n. So it would be great if you could share a list of the mentioned authors later on. So
Sure.
that is a request from her, and also some of our students also made this request.
So I'll be happy to share a list of authors from India, from the global south, because I believe that our own literatures has this wonderful potential. Because if we look at indigenous theories like Thinai, Tamil, the Sangam Tamil
Yes.
culture has the Thinai theory, which is
Right. Yes.
theory about bioregional dwelling, where every aspect of the human is wedded with the land. So whether it's the tree or the deity or the flower or the scape, or the emotion associated with that particular scape. It is one gestalt. So, I mean, nature thinking has come, we can go back to Aranya Sanskriti by Sri Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore, and I mean, and contemporary writing.
Yes.
In fact, my research scholar is from your own college, and he has this
Oh.
passion to work. Yes,
Yes.
Sanchar Sarkar. I'll be happy to
Right. Right.
share this meeting with him. So. Pockets of the country, I think whether it's Kerala, West Bengal, but I'll be interested to see what kind of writing comes out of the deserts. Like we have Rajasthan, but not enough translation is being done. See, I think that's the problem. So as eco-critics, I think one service we can do to the field of academics is to kind of translate our regional text into English so that more people read them through the world. So that's one way of letting the world know that our narratives are also open-ended, creative.
Yes.
Yes, sure. I'll be happy to do that.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. The next question we have from Shayanton Lahiri. He asks that nature has always been discussed in negative terms, a process of, within quote, going back, binary to culture or progress. So can we engage in the study of ecocriticism which can align nature with advancement? A common argument about the Anthropocene is that it is a result of Renaissance humanism. So can we say that ecocriticism is primarily a post-human approach?
Is eco-criticism is primarily? Sorry,
Primarily a post-human approach.
Okay. Well, thanks for that question. So, are nature and culture pitted as binaries? No, I think the Bruno Latourian nature culture continuum, I think it works. I mean, it's just not a theoretical model because you can't utter the word man without uttering the word nature. I think Marx talks about it. And it's especially significant when we talk about livelihood issues in countries like ours. So, is it against development? Um, I think the best answer to this would be Ram Guha's book, How Much Can a Person Consume? So, yes. So, I think eco-criticism also calls for what eco-philosopher Joanna Macy refers to as the great turning. It's also bringing into um, the light of awareness what we really need, right? Let me give you a nice example. This is an example of, how we cannot, do away with the strides in development and perhaps the detritus left by developmental policies. So this is called the Nuclear Guardianship Program, spearheaded by Joanna Macy and her group of academic activists. So this is what they do. They visit all the nuclear sites along the western coast of the United States periodically to check whether radioactive substances have leached from their containers. So there is solid practical work. They have transformed these these sites into prayer sites. So they call it um, a guardianship site. And in fact, they recite prayers to the green fire, which is the fire of nuclear energy. So we need to remember, I'm struck by this example because we have the Bhopal gas tragedy. We had the Bhopal gas tragedy. But every now and then, even post-lockdown, I think we have these seepages and leakages. We don't seem to remember. We just forget and keep going. So Well, the environmental awareness is also about paying attention to small things. It begins with the self before it can truly uh, blossom into the expanded self. So that's the first part of the question. And I'm sorry, the
Yes.
second part, you had a question about the Anthropocene.
Yes.
I failed to get that.
No, ma'am. The question is,
Yeah.
yes, post-humanist, yeah, right.
Uh,
Post-human approach.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't call it a post-human approach because, see, one thing that modernity has done to all of us is this whole project of disenchantment. Max Weber talks about it, right?
Okay, okay.
Because that sense of wonder is gone. So when the sense of wonder is gone, we have just played havoc with nature. So the Anthropocene exists, has to be perhaps transmuted into the Symbiocene, right? We have so many of these catchy phrases floating around. So the Symbiocene makes a very forceful case for re-enchantment, because the only way to perhaps effectively engage with environmental problems is through affect. We need to be emotionally connected. If post-humanism means, I mean, like a cyborg, human machine miscegenations, if we are just going to lose sight of that effect, it's going to be a little troublesome. So we have to navigate that trajectory from the Anthropocene to the Symbiocene. So the re-enchantment, or when we fall back in love with nature, perhaps there is a more evolved, blossoming human. It's no longer post-human. Have I exceeded time, Pranab?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much, ma'am. We have a. Oh, yeah. Thank you so much, ma'am. So we have a question from Devashish বিশ্বাস. He asks that, is eco-critical theory good enough for development of nature? How do you think about the impact of the Aboriginal people to protect the environment? Oh, so you can read that, ma'am.
Yes, I have seen. Okay, thank you so much, Debashish, for that question. I think it's a very important question because I became acutely aware of this question. How do you think Aboriginal people relate to and protect the environment when I work with a text like Mailama? This David and Goliath struggle about this frail Adivasi woman who took on this, multinational giant. How did it happen? So, her life narrative basically, I mean, it's an oral narrative, but when you read it, you realize that this lady is perhaps more evolved than all of us, academicians and writers cogitating about the subject. Because to her, the forest is home. The water in her well is her water, because her community is dependent on it, and her children fall sick because the groundwater became polluted as a result of Coca-Cola. Distinction between the oikion and the politikon. Oikion is the home, which is the space for women, children, servants, right? And there is the story about Odysseus, who comes back from his travels. And he suspects that his wife Penelope has not been faithful to him. He also suspects that her slave girls are up to some hanky panky, and therefore he hangs all of them. And I mean, the epic says this even without a murmur of, remorse, right? So, why does this happen? Because anything which is your chattel, because slave girls are your property. that belongs to the home. It's a disempowered space. Whereas the politicon is the place where the action happens, where you have activism, where you have development, where you have men, where you have everything that belongs to the trajectory of success. So, people like Mailama, people like C.K. Janu from, the Adivasi lady who spearheaded the Mutanga struggle, and Mahashweta Devi, who's also called the Adivasi Mahashweta, although she does not belong to the tribal community. All these people have clearly established that protecting the environment is not an add-on. It's like protecting your own self, right? I was fortunate enough to meet John Seed, an eco-activist who has done a lot of, conservation of rainforests in Australia. And despite many odds. So I asked him, how did you pluck up the courage to kind of face all these odds? So he says, well, what a strange question you are asking me. When I do something for the rainforest, I am just protecting myself, right? Or he says it's just a part of the rainforest protecting itself. So, I mean, he is not a poet, he's an activist, but look at the way he articulates it. And also our very own waterman of India, Sri Rajendra Singh, who has revived 8 dead rivers. I mean, that's amazing. I wrote a short story in his honor because after meeting him, I was so impressed because this man was almost beaten to death by the sand mafia, but he persisted. It's the same attitude, right? So, I mean, what you do for nature it's like caring for your own self. So when that sense of self becomes very extended, there is you don't see it as activism, or you don't see it as a special activity. It is the most natural thing to do. Thank you for that question. Okay, let me read out the question. Do you think that symbolizing the forest and as a threat for humans, of the wild as opposed to the human as a reason for exploitation of nature today? Thank you so much, because this is actually Mr. Arya's question is a question about what wilderness can mean in a global south context, right? So because wilderness has always been the other. If you go back to the origin of the world, it's Wildioren, the old English word. But if you look at the way Western cultures have approached wilderness, we have to go back to that earth trope of Western literature, right? The book of Genesis. So you have the Garden of Eden, and when the first pair are expelled, they are thrown into the wilderness. So that's a punishment. So the wilderness is something which is uncivilized, something where nature is untamed, uncontrolled, right? But later on, it became a revisionist exercise for the environmentalists of the 60s and 70s in America, like Gary Snyder, he has an entire book called The Practice of Wilderness, because wilderness is it's the mother. That's from where you draw your original strength and courage, and I mean, that's your home, right? That's your home. We have moved away from the mother, right? But if you look at environmental policy, I think the preservation of wilderness was a huge privilege, because when they carved national parks, wilderness preserves, I think they drove out the original inhabitants. We have to remember that. But this also may have been the case with our own country, because we do have representations of the wilderness in our epics, like the Mahabharata. So when the Indraprastha palace is going to be built, I think Agni is symbolized as this very hungry person who says, "I want fodder," and you have this, very, I don't know, unsettling image of the burning of the Khandava forest, right? And am I exceeding time, Pranam?
No, it's okay. It's okay,
It's
ma'am.
okay.
Yeah.
How much more time do I have?
Ma'am, I think we can conclude in 5 minutes, maybe.
5 minutes. Okay, let me just finish this.
Yeah.
Okay. So the burning of the Khandava forest also mentions creatures like kinnaras, kimpurishas, strange, semi-human shapes who come rushing out. So historians who kind of reread these epics say, well, perhaps it was also about civilization, or about civilization entering the forest, and all these kinnaras and kimpurishas are perhaps they were the Adivasis. So a lot of the forest struggles in our own age and times are to do with the original inhabitants, isn't it? So, so the wild is not opposed to reason. The wild, even here, even in our context, is seen as something which has to be preserved. Andaman and Nicobar Islands, if you read that wonderful novel by Pankaj Saskaria, The Last Wave. So the Jarawa tribes, who are perhaps the only uncontacted tribes in the world today. So there is a forest reserve, and the Jarawas are meant to be there. But this forest reserve is on one side of the road. The other side of the road, it is accessible to tourists. So is the purity of the forest sacrosanct? No, right? So we are invading the forest, right? So what we are doing is, see, some of these tribes don't want to be in contact, but the last wave will even problematize that for us. The Jarawas also want medical facilities. They also like the things we like. They also why? Because we have touched up with their original system, right? Civilization of tribes. So the forests were self-sufficient dwelling, oikic space for these original inhabitants. But we have, or mainstream cultures, I mean, I think we have literally infiltrated the forest. So it can also be seen as a struggle for rights, a struggle for existence. But to answer your question, is it seen as opposite to reason? Yes, we call it jungly, which is uncivilized, right? The forest is still a place of fear, or it's a place where you can lose your inhibitions. Days and nights in the forest, Aranyar, oh my God, who wrote it? Somebody from your own state. It'll come back to me. So these four young men who go out into the forest, and they just lose their inhibitions. So the forest has multiple connotations, right? So if I will conclude with this, if in the original Indic view, the forest was a place of reflection, you wrote your Aranyakas, you communed with the Supreme. But what we have today are Nava Aranyakas, new forest texts, which are written by women, which are written by tribals fighting for their rights. So the forest is a space of conflict, right? So which we have to keep in mind. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. And I thank all the participants uh, for, for responding to ma'am's lecture so nicely. This has been really engaging. Thank you so much, ma'am, for elaborately guiding us to an understanding of the discipline with such lucidity. We look forward to hosting you once again in some of the capacities in our college.
Sure, Pranam.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you. Have a good night. Thank you. Bye. I request our participants to be with us. We had Professor Nair with us. Sorry, we could not take all the questions. Sorry, we could not take all the questions. We will now go to the session with Professor Nair, our plenary lecturer, our plenary speaker for today's conference. So please bear with us for 2 minutes. We're linking the system to Professor Nair's system.
Yeah, it's coming. It's here, right? Yes, and I'll just come up.
Professor,
It's already there. You just have to.
Yeah. I muted myself there.
Oh, then you just go back.
This is taking months.
I'll just leave it at it. Speak.
Hello, Professor Nair. Hello. 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 Professor Nair. Yeah, am I audible now? Yeah. Yes, sir, you are audible. Yes, sir, you are audible. Okay. So can we go then now? Yeah.
It's there. It's already on the YouTube.
All right, sir. After I open it, I'll mute it. Yeah. He wants his students to allow.
I think let the student go on the YouTube, otherwise it will be his image will not come.
Okay. So yes, sir. We're having this problem. We're allowing, sir. Please allow us 1 moment. Yeah. Sure. It is now time for the plenary talk, which will be delivered by Professor Pramod K. Nair. Legendary professor like him indeed needs no introduction. However, to formally introduce him, Professor Nair teaches at the Department of English, University of Hyderabad. He has received numerous prestigious fellowships, including the Smarts Visiting Fellowship in Commonwealth Studies at the University of Cambridge, the Charles Wallace India Trust British Council Fellowship at the University of Kent at Canterbury in the UK, and the Fulbright Fellowship at Cornell University. He has lectured at the Universities of Oxford, Edinburgh, Sussex, South Carolina, Columbia, to name a few. In 2018, he received the Visitors Award for Best Research in the Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences from the Honorable President of India. In 2020, a study conducted by the Center for Publication Ethics, Pune, showed that Nair was the second most published researcher in arts and humanities in India and South Asia, and 7th in South and Southeast Asia, in terms of work indexed in the Web of Science. Professor Nair has authored books on a wide range of areas, and his books have been published by Routledge, Cambridge University Press, Bloomsbury, Calvin Macmillan, William Blackwell, Sage, Roman and Littlefield, to name a few. It is indeed a proud privilege for the department to host Professor Nair in this conference. I request Professor Nair to deliver his lecture. Professor Nair, it's over to you now. Yes. Yeah.
That's fine. You will just see what will happen. That's all right. Then in that case, that. Vice Chancellor.
হ্যাঁ, রামচন্দ্র শোনা যাচ্ছে কিছু? কিছু করার নেই গো, কিছু করার না। আমি তোমাকে গুগল মিটের লিঙ্ক পাঠাচ্ছি, তুমি স্ক্রিন রেকর্ড করো, ঠিক আছে? না হলে ওনার এই রেকর্ড করার কিছু উপায় থাকবে না। হুম, ঠিক আছে, রাখলাম। না কিছু শোনা যাচ্ছে না?
Remote address change. আমাকে কার্য অনুশীলনী প্রয়োজিত ভাবেই না।
Maharaj, they are saying that on YouTube nothing is audible. So I have also checked that it's not audible. So Maharaj, what I have done is I have shared the link on YouTube and I asked people to join their Google. I mean,
That's why he's speaking in Google right now.
yeah, he is speaking on Google Meet now.
Okay. So how is it?
Yeah, do we have any alternative? I don't think so. So yeah, yeah.
জ্ঞান কিসের?
জানি না স্যার, আর বলবেন না।
No, I know that one.
Yeah.
You shared the link on YouTube, right?
Yeah. And we can end the podcast.
Yeah, it's possible to engage. Do you use Firefox? I mean, do you use Chrome? Which has been covered for that?
No, when he said this to me, I told him, sir, do we have a plan B? And he said that let's hope for the best. What does this mean? Right? If you would have asked yes, go for a plan B. So you would have done that.
Seems to be
And
right.
also, he started at 4:30. He joined at 5:45. 15 minutes back to his stop. Is it possible?
You had not told before that.
তো just just consider his arrogance.
High profile person.
Yeah, very arrogant.
That's why it's so much.
Second in researcher.
That's what I heard.
Not so.
You can stop it. There's no point in continuing this.
How I accept those things about ठीक है चलो that's right.
What's the link? What's the link of good sharing vision? Where is the link? Oh, okay, that. Yeah, you can go for a break.
Yeah. We have no choice.
Then you can tell them. No, the string here you can stop it. I don't see it. End dot.
All these questions will be saved.
Yeah, it will be.